Hey everybody, welcome back to the Beamer Barn. Today we're going to be looking at my newly purchased manual transmission E53 X5, and we're going to do a top to bottom inspection to determine exactly what is wrong with this car. I've been driving it for the past couple of weeks, and besides the leaking radiator, there's definitely a few things wrong with the drivetrain, and I haven't even looked underneath it. There's tons of clunking going on. There's things that aren't working on the dashboard. So let's go ahead and make a list so that we can determine what we need to fix and in what priority. And by the end of this video, we'll have a good understanding of what you guys should look for as well on your E53 X5. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right to work. So before we look at the car and get underneath it and start getting dirty, let's go ahead and give it a fault scan really quick to determine what electrical issues it might have, and it'll give us some hints as to what we need to look at in the engine bay. Doing a fault scan should be your first step in diagnosing a car when you're having a problem with it. And as you can see, this car has a ton of lights on the dashboard, and what sucks is that the instrument cluster display has that dead pixel issue, which is so common with E39s, but about the same instrument cluster there and same problem on the radio as well. So I can barely see what channel we're on, but maybe we'll do an upgrade radio in the future. For now, I'm going to give you guys a look at the fault codes, and I have not even scanned this car yet, so let's find out together what's wrong with it. First thing that we see, DSC return pump fault. It might need a flush. That fluid might be old. DME activation of the fuel pump relay. That I don't think that would cause an engine light. And then we have a DMTL fault for the tank leak. So that's pretty common. Might just have a bad gas cap, or it might be like the solenoid or something else there. Honestly, let's see. Now, I was expecting like pages on pages of codes, but I don't see a lot here. And like I said, I haven't even cleared it. This is just my first reaction. So what I'm seeing here, the prioritized stuff would probably be the DSC return pump. That could be just a brake flush and a bleeding procedure to make it come back to life, but it could be an entire return pump or maybe the module. But I don't see any other faults, so it could just be that pump itself. And then for the DME, just that activation for the fuel pump and the tank leakage. So those two faults. Now while we're here, I'm gonna go and do a test of that return pump. Maybe we can see if it's working or not. So doing a quick test there, it does not look too good. I can hear the relays firing, but I'm not hearing those pumps, either the pre-charge or the return pump for the DSC module activating. Usually you'd get like a good whirring noise out of those. So we might have a pretty serious fault there, but it wouldn't be too hard to change out a DSC module. Now besides that, quickly we'll go over some of the problems here. Obviously the instrument cluster having the dead pixels, radio being bad. Now you see here the shift boot. I kind of put this on as best I could, but it definitely needs a new shift boot here. That's a problem. There's also like a detent problem. So where this car would go into fifth gear, sometimes it gets stuck over there. So look at that. It's not exactly like going back to true center, I would say, and that could be a serious transmission issue. And besides that, a couple other things in here would have to be I think the cup holder. I think that should be a cup holder right there, or maybe some of you guys can let me know. It's kind of messed up. And then the window regulator is, I guess, missing or messed up here as well. So the window actually fell down when I parked the car in the garage. I definitely want to put that first thing on my list of things to fix, because we don't want rain getting in the car while we're parking it outside. Otherwise, interior is really nice, besides kind of like the mixed and matched body panels. But more importantly, let's go ahead now and start looking underneath the car and at the engine as well. So as you can see, I removed the intake cover, this shroud up here that directs air into the airbox, and now the engine bay is looking a lot more familiar, more like an E46 330 engine bay. So everything is centrally located. You've got plenty of working room, that's for sure, since it's a kind of a smaller motor in what would be like a V8 engine bay, because most of the X5s were sold with a bigger motor. But this is going to make it just easier for us to work on. You do see that the valve cover looks like it's been serviced. Oops. It's definitely been serviced recently. You can tell by the RTV right there, the red RTV. It's pretty dusty in here, so I'm hoping not a lot of oil. It's looking dry down the side there. Usually there'd be like oil on some of these heat shields here where it would leak down from the valve cover, but that's looking nice and dry. Over here, a little bit of rust on some of the, brackets and such, but I guess, maybe this car did some traveling around a few states and, it's older, so a little bit of rust is to be expected, but I haven't seen anything on the chassis yet, although we haven't even looked underneath it. But yeah, I don't think there's anything up here to be super cautious of. The hose for the secondary air system looks good. The valve that's for the DMTL system, it's actually right under there. You can see one of the fittings for the hose, and the electrical connector is right there as well. I could probably test this. I have like a little press button, so I'll probably do that soon and see if that solenoid's bad, because if that's bad, that would definitely cause our check engine light. But if it's not bad, then it would probably be something like a bad hose that's leaking air, or like a bad fuel pump seal, and we do have a fuel pump code, so maybe it's time to replace that fuel pump. But let me go ahead now and we'll put the car up on the quick jacks. This is a 4,800 pound SUV, and the quick jacks support 5,000 pounds, so I think we should have enough room with the ceiling here. Hopefully we can get the car lifted up and take a good look at the suspension and the bushings underneath, which I think is going to give us a lot of things to do on this build. Now, my biggest concern when I bought this car was the previous owner telling me that it had a radiator leak, and I wasn't able to really pinpoint it at first, but getting underneath the car, it was pretty clear that it was coming from the radiator itself and from the more common area, which is where the plastic end caps of the radiator meet to the aluminum core. So what happens is that the metal and the plastic, they expand and contract at different rates, and so when you heat cycle that radiator, it's going to start leaking. So we'll replace that. But the other thing that I saw while I was up here was the front control arm bushings, which are just completely torn, probably never been replaced before, and that's going to be a recurring theme on this car, things never having been replaced. But since I'm able to pry them loose with just a small pry bar, then I think that it means it's time to service those really soon, actually, because it drives really sloppy. Now, looking at the engine itself, things are super oily and greasy down here. It looks like probably the oil pan's been leaking for a long time and it's never been replaced, as well as possibly the power steering pump leaking fluid from more than likely the hoses around it. The differential in the front as well is also coated in oil, but possibly power steering fluid as well, or maybe differential fluid. It's kind of hard to tell. It wouldn't surprise me if it was leaking though. The rest of the suspension components all look original, so we'll probably try to replace all of them, maybe one piece at a time. It is going to be pretty expensive to do everything. It's similar suspension, I'd say, to like an E39. And then something else that's pretty concerning is the amount of rust on the studs of the exhaust, and this tells me two things: that the car has most likely spent some time up north, because this rust is pretty deep for the age of this car, and then that this exhaust has never been replaced before, so I'm sure that the clutch is original as well. So the transmission looks especially oily. It's probably just engine oil that's been flung onto it and is causing that mess. But what we did notice is that the transfer case looks like it's been serviced or rebuilt before in Syracuse, New York, and so that confirms our suspicions that the car has spent some winters up north. Now, the surface rust that we see on the subframe isn't that bad at all, but what is concerning is seeing that the trailer hitch has a missing bolt that should be attaching it to the subframe. So we probably want to find the right bolt for that and get it bolted up correctly. Now, the next thing that we did while we were back here was testing the differential to see if the bushings were bad, but what was weird is that I could not get the differential to move very much. And looking at the bushings themselves, they looked like they were original, however they weren't really busted up or torn either. So it kind of told me that my clunk that I get from shifting is probably not coming from the differential bushings, and I had to look elsewhere. So I went back to the front of the car to the transmission, I grabbed my pry bar, and sure enough, this transmission has way too much play in it. And of course, when you look closer at the bushing, it's going to be obvious. This bushing's never been replaced before. It's made out of rubber, and it's soaking up the oil that's leaking around it and just causing like a more premature failure. So that is where our clunking is coming from. And then, looking back at the rear subframe, I just want to look at the subframe bushings, and looking close in there, they are cracked. So we'll probably have to service those at some point, but it doesn't appear to be causing any issues right now. Alright, so we're all done underneath the X5, and I hope that the B-roll was worth it, because I'm all greasy now and full of dirty stains. But we've got a running list here. Let's go ahead and recap and then add on the few things that we saw at the end there in terms of like the clunking noise and all that. So the faults showed us that we had a DMTL fault that can easily be solved. Hopefully it's just a purge valve or a loose line or vacuum line. Then the DSC, that has a return pump fault and possibly a bad pre-charge pump as well. So that might need to be replaced altogether with the separate return pump. I think that they're two little modules. The instrument cluster pixels, those are pretty easy to fix. The radio, you know, we could go with an OEM one or like an Android head unit. That might be the move. Then we've got the transmission, so like that shifter feels really wonky. Probably the detents need to be replaced and maybe the bushings as well. Then the window regulator, which, you know, that's gonna be top of the list because we don't want the car to get rained inside of. The radiator, which is gonna be next because it is leaking. It's got that crack basically between the aluminum and the plastic shell. Then you've got the front control arm bushings that make it really sketchy to steer, makes it really loose in the front. The oil pan and the differential seals appear to be leaking, so the differential seals, you know, the differential fluid I think is a different color. That's why there's like red oil leaking, but then there's clearly like an oil pan leak as well. So none of that stuff has been serviced clearly, but at least the axles are in good condition. Also the power steering system looks like it has a leak, probably like the feed line or something as such. And you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and assume that the engine mounts have also not been replaced. So we'll add that to the list, and that way when we do the oil pan, we're gonna go ahead and replace those engine mounts. Now it was surprising to find that the differential bushings weren't bad and that our clunk is probably coming from our transmission mount. Now even though the transfer case was probably serviced before, it looks like in Syracuse in New York, the transmission mount is definitely original and it's just falling apart. So there's so much play in that transmission that it's definitely causing that clunk. And the differential looks like, you know, it might be the original bushings, but it doesn't appear to have any big movement back there. So the only thing back there is going to be the subframe mounts, which are definitely deteriorated, but we'll go ahead and do all those bushings at the same time. But it's worth noting that the subframe is going to be a pretty big job, so that'll be probably on the last of the list of things that we need to do on this X5. Now that's everything that I found wrong with my X5, but if you saw something on camera that I forgot to add to the list, be sure to let me know with a comment down below. This is gonna be a long-term build for the channel, and it's gonna be a long-term car for me. It's gonna be made for towing, so we definitely wanna get that hitch fixed up, which is missing a bolt. So small things like that I wanna get taken care of, and then over time, we'll just work to get rid of rust, get, you know, the subframe bushings done, which is gonna be a big job. Just tons of stuff I think that'll make this car like a great daily/tow rig. So if you enjoyed this series, be sure to leave a like down below and comment, like I said, if I miss anything or if you have any recommendations of what kind of services we should do on this car. And if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to the channel. As always, I hope you guys have an amazing day, and we'll see you next time.